All right, it is 1 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Aubrey, and I'm a member of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this installment of our Fresh Fair webinar series titled Essential Elements for Sharing a Data Package. Next slide, please. Today's webinar will include presentations from 3 different speakers and will be followed by a live question and answer session. If at any point you have a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll bring it up during the question and answer session after the presentation. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be shared with all registrants. Next slide, please. The objectives for today's webinar that I want to highlight are the importance of data to the NIH HEAL initiative, planning for data sharing, components of a well-organized data package, peer learning, a HEAL study team data packaging experience, and an additional data packaging example and resources. Next slide, please. Today's 3 presenters are Sarah Meyer, Dr. Brianna Larrick, and Christy Carpenter. Sarah Meyer is a data steward in the data management group at Frenzy. Sarah provides subject matter expertise and technical support for the HEAL Data Stewardship Group on data curation, reuse, and harmonization. She has experience in public health program evaluation, human subject translational research, community-based research, data management, HIPAA compliance, and technical training. Dr. Brianna Larrick is a senior scientific project manager at the University of Chicago Center for Translational Data Science. With 8 years of scientific program and project management experience in the nonprofit and academic sectors, Dr. Larrick serves as project manager of the HEAL data platform. Her background is in preclinical research, focusing on cellular and animal models of metabolic chronic disease. Christy Carpenter is a 5th-year PhD candidate in biomedical informatics at Stanford University. She is a researcher on a HEAL-funded team at Stanford that is using social media text to identify and predict trends in the opioid crisis. In addition to population-level text data, her PhD research also focuses on the molecular level, examining drug binding pockets throughout the human proteome with applications to drug development and repurposing for opioid use disorder treatment and beyond. At this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Sarah Meyer.
Thank you, Aubrey. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to speak today. Data sharing supports both scientific and community-driven priorities, creating a more open, efficient, and innovative research ecosystem. It maximizes NIH's investment. It drives meaningful scientific and public health advancements in the following ways. Enhancing reproducibility enables researchers to verify findings and strengthen the credibility of scientific research. Accelerating discovery by providing broad access to data, helping researchers identify patterns, test hypotheses, and drive innovation. Fostering collaboration, which promotes interdisciplinary and global partnerships, advancing scientific products. Maximizing impact to ensure research investments that yield greatest scientific and public health benefits. Supporting transparency. Research integrity builds public trust. Empowering communities and providing patients, advocates, policymakers, and educators with data to inform decisions. And advancing AI readiness and machine readability to improve data quality, reduce errors, and enhance automation for more effective and machine learning and AI-ready tools. What we know is that well-structured data is fundamental to advancing research. Well-structured data requires planning at every stage of the data lifecycle. This diagram outlines the basic stages of a data lifecycle. If we start from the bottom left and go on the Ferris wheel of our data lifecycle, we know that careful planning and design prevents gaps and inconsistencies in data collection. Systematic data collection and capture ensures that data is recorded accurately and reliably. Collaboration and analysis transform data into meaningful insights. Active data management maintains accessibility and quality throughout the project. Secure storage and preservation protect data from loss or misuse. And thoughtful sharing and publishing maximize visibility, impact, and reuse. So this slide outlines 4 specific areas in the data submission process where HEAL stewards have noted or identified how a proactive approach to data management helps streamline the data submission and it reduces the burden on researchers. First of all, planning for data sharing early helps align with the HEAL and the NIH requirements for specific data types that are required to use both HEAL common data elements or to use a minimum data set or standardized variables as part of a research network or program. Identifying the repository and associated requirements earlier in the research cycle is crucial. Repositories may have specific data package requirements that impact data collection, analysis, or submission. These include required or preferred file formats, metadata standards, and in some cases, pre-submission forms or special documentation. A few examples include the NIMH Data Archive, or we call it NDA, which requires a data submission agreement and variables to be formatted in a specific data structure. For generalist repositories like Figshare, organizing data into well-labeled folders keeps related files together. It preserves structure and context for easier reuse. For imaging data, understanding key expectations like de-identification, file size limits, transformation processes, and metadata formats help streamline submission and ensure that data is well prepared and will be accepted by the repository. Budgeting time and resources. Plan for data submission by estimating effort and allowing time to meet the repository requirements. Submissions may take multiple attempts. There may be file failures. There may be other things that prolong the data submission, and the data submission may occur over several months if there are multiple steps to the process. Later in this presentation, you will see 2 data package examples. Both data examples chose their repository specifically for the type of data that they are collecting in the study and organized both their data and their metadata to meet those repository requirements. The NIH data management and sharing policy defines when data should be shared in the research lifecycle. Data should be shared as early as possible, but no later than either at the time of the associated publication or at the end of the performance period of the grant. If you publish before your end of performance period, the data underlying the publication results needs to be shared in a HEAL compliant repository. Data must be accessible by the publication date, whether that is print or electronic. Data that is produced with grant funds should be shared by the end of the performance period, even if the related work will be published at a later date. This includes data from preprints, conference recordings, and even negative findings. Additionally, NIH policies or specific funding opportunities may require earlier data sharing, so it's important to follow those timelines if applicable. Well-organized data is essential for effective data sharing, and it aligns with the FAIR principles. Those are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. By ensuring that data meets these standards, we maximize its impact and promote transparency, collaboration, and reproducibility in research. To effectively apply these principles, it's important to understand how they translate into real-world data sharing practices. Our next two presenters will dive deeper into the components of FAIR, focusing on preparing a data package and submitting data underlying a presentation or publication to a repository. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Brianna Lyric.
All right, thank you, Sarah, for that introduction on why data sharing is important and what it means to share data in a way that is fair. So what I'll be sharing today is some guidance that we've developed on data packaging and sharing that is meant to be broadly applicable to HEAL investigators. I'll talk with you about what you should be thinking about when you're preparing to share your data, and also about the specific components that we should be putting into our data package. So if we go to the next slide. Okay. So when you're thinking about what all should I include when I'm preparing to share my data package, it's helpful to think about what your data sharing goal is. What are you trying to do, or what are you trying to enable when you are sharing your data? So here on this slide, we've listed 3 common data sharing goals. The first is perhaps you are trying to enable replication of a published analysis. So as Sarah already alluded to, if you're trying to share the data underlying results in a peer-reviewed publication, or a paper that you've posted to a preprint server, or perhaps a poster that you're presenting at a conference, what you're trying to do here is enable someone to perform exactly the analyses that you've published in your published work. So you would share all and only the data underlying those results. And when you're doing this, it may be the case that this is actually a subset of the data that are generated over the course of an entire study. If we move on to the second example here, perhaps you're data archiving. So in this case, generated over the course of a study. And in this case, what we want to do is permit secondary users to replicate results you've published, but also to plan and perform their own independent analyses. Perhaps they are extending the work that you've done. The third data sharing goal that we've put here is perhaps you're participating in a collaborative project. In this case, data that you're submitting from your site or hub or study may be intended to, or you're intending to share those primarily to be analyzed or archived together with data from other sites or hubs or studies. This could be as part of a planned meta or mega analysis, or it could be archiving with a domain-specific repository. And in this case, when you're preparing your data set, it's often the case that you need to meet very specific requirements and harmonization with other data that are going to the same place. So now that we've thought about what our data sharing goal is and what you're trying to do when you share data, we'll, on the next slide, take a look at what exactly should you be sharing. So I've listed some individual components here, but ultimately the thing to keep in mind is that when you're sharing data, you should be sharing enough information that someone who is in your field or adjacent to your field of study, but not familiar with your study itself, they should have the information that they need to understand what you did and how to appropriately leverage the material and the files and the data that you're sharing. So someone coming in with no familiarity about your study specifically, but with the skills to understand it with the appropriate context. So there are 4 things. Let me try to mute an app here. Sorry about that. So there are 4 things that someone needs in order to understand what's going on with your shared data. The first piece that you want to include in your data package is some study level metadata. So this is information about the study you conducted that will help the user understand the context of what's being shared. So what was your study design? What kind of subjects or cell or animal model did you use? What were your specific aims? Just large strokes, what kind of study did you conduct? If there are any terms or restrictions governing the use of the data that you're sharing, this is a great place to put that. The second piece here is file level metadata. So in your data package, you're sharing a collection of files, and it is very helpful for someone to be able to come in and see and understand what you've shared without having to open up each file individually and sift through the contents to try to, interpret and understand what is in there. So file level metadata would be a file that identifies each file that you've shared in your package with a brief description of what the file contains. And if you use specific techniques or protocols or a specific version of a software to generate the files that you're sharing in this package, this is a great place to put that kind of information. The third piece to include in your data package is variable level metadata. So this is similar to a dictionary or a code book, but variable level metadata is one or more files that collectively describe each and every variable that is included in your shared data set. So this would at a minimum be the variable name and a title or description of what that variable is. No one should have to open up your data files and guess at what variables are included in there. We should include this information. If there are measurement units or possible or valid values that are specific to the variable or constraints on the variable, that kind of information is what goes into variable level metadata. So the context needed to understand the actual data files. And then last but not least, the fourth component of a data package is the data files themselves. So the shared data, you could share the raw or unprocessed data files. You could share post-processed or curated data files. Either way is fine, but if you're sharing anything that's been processed, information on how that has been processed is important to include. So those are the four pieces. And collectively, these four things represent really the minimal information that is necessary for someone to come in and make sense of the data that you're sharing. So if one or more of these things are missing, if you don't include a code book or there's no data dictionary or variable level metadata, someone would have to guess, at what exactly is in your data files. If there's no study level metadata, that really is critical context for understanding the materials that are being shared. So it's not that many things. It's four key components. But if we go to the next slide, there are a few things that are above and beyond these four basic components, but that really add substantial scientific and analytic value to a shared data set. So while not part of the four, essential components, we really encourage people to include, when possible, a few other things. This includes persistent identifiers, so such as DOIs, to publications that are generated from the data. This is helpful for both you and people who are leveraging your data in that it aids in replication, but it also, if you've published a paper with these data already, this is substantial additional documentation that you can include with your data set with little to no extra work on your part. It provides a lot, possibly all of the information, about the study that someone would need to interpret and work with your data. The second piece here is, in addition to a variable name and description in your variable level metadata, you can include additional metadata such as links to the source of specific items or instruments that you've used. So if you've used a HEAL common data element, links to the CDE repository, links to the NIH Phoenix toolkit, or any other specific measurement instrument that you've used would provide users with the exact version or source of what's been utilized in your study. It's very helpful for someone who's coming in and making use of your data. The third item here is protocols for executing the study. If you utilized specific protocols for collecting your data, cleaning your data, curating the data, if you used any procedures for managing the data, that is all very helpful information for someone to have when they come in and try to make use of what you've shared. And I have two more items on the next slide. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. The first is if you could include code that was used to perform specific data transformations. For example, if you published a paper and as part of that you generated some derived variables. The code used to execute that is very helpful to share. If you reorganize the data to facilitate a specific analysis, that's also very helpful to share. Along similar lines, if there is code that exists that can be executed to translate your raw data files together with corresponding variable level metadata into a format that's commonly used, analytic format that's commonly used, such as Stata or R or SAS. If you have that code available, that's also very helpful to help people get, from the raw data files into a format that they might use for analysis. And then finally, if you utilize pipelines to validate assertions about the data, so if there are skip patterns, if you're conducting a human subject study and there's an instrument that was administered where one question was skipped if a particular answer was given to a previous item, pipelines to validate those types of assertions about your data are also very helpful to secondary users. Okay, and I have just one more slide here. So this is a screenshot of the guidance that we have prepared. And so I'm going to drop the link to this into the chat. Here we go. Oops. There we go. So I encourage all of you to take a look at it. This guidance contains the information I just shared, but it also contains additional information on recommended, oh yeah, thank you. It contains information on recommended file formats when you're sharing data. It contains information on that is helpful for de-identification of data generated from human subject studies, how to handle missing values, and we also have a section at the bottom with some NIH and other third-party data sharing resources that we think will be helpful to the HEAL research community. So this documentation will be shared. It's shared in the chat. It will also be distributed after this webinar to all registrants. So we do encourage you to take a look. And if you have any questions or if your team is running into trouble, running into any roadblocks while you're preparing your data for sharing, we encourage you to reach out for us. This guidance is meant to contain the information that is helpful for a study team who's maybe doing this for the first time, or the second time or the third time. But we were very intentional about keeping it streamlined and concise so that it remains accessible and readable, ideally without anyone wanting to tear their hair out. So that's the balance we tried to strike. And if you have any questions or things that you're running into that aren't addressed in here, we're very open to that feedback and would love to hear from you. So with that, I will now pass it along to Christy Carpenter, who will share her study team's data packaging and sharing experience.
Hi, thanks, Brianna. So again, my name is Christy. I'm a graduate student, and I'm going to be sharing today about my experience with preparing a data package for submission to the HEAL data platform and just some lessons learned and best practices. Okay, next slide. So just a quick introduction to the study that I'll be talking about today. So this project was kind of a combination of a primary analysis and also a literature review. So the team that I'm a part of is using social media text to identify and predict trends in the opioid crisis. And part of this study in particular was to try to identify platforms beyond Reddit and Twitter, which are the most common platforms used for this type of analysis, which meant that we were looking at a lot of different types of platforms and also examining the literature to see which platforms were used for which kinds of studies. So the data that was coming out of this was a lot of CSVs, some that were just manually filled out, some that were generated by pipelines of ours on social media platform information. We had both formal and informal, so slang, misspelling, opioid terms that we use. So we include that as a data type. We have some free text output from large language models. And then in addition to this data that was generated, we also wanted to share our scripts for the data analysis and the figure generation. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to be going through the GitHub. So this was how we shared our data package. And I'm sure this is a familiar site for many of you attending this webinar, but this is just the GitHub and the organization of the files. Next slide. So I'll be walking through the README, which Brianna mentioned earlier as a place to put the study level metadata. So in our README, we have the title of the study, we have all the authors, We have a link to our preprint, and when the paper is published, we'll include the information to access the manuscript. We have data dictionary. So the data dictionary is those file level metadata and also variable level metadata that Brianna mentioned. And then in the rest of the README, I'm walking through each file in the repository, describing what it is and what it was used for. And I've organized it here by different phases of our analysis. Next slide, please. So just to point out a few more things that we've included in this README. One is we have some data that were generated by other pipelines that are described in previous papers of ours. So we link to those references so that if folks are interested, they can check out those papers and understand the methodology that was used to create those data. And then if you look further down into that item number 4, for the scripts, I've always found it useful to include usage examples. So giving an example on how you call the script, which arguments are required, what are the types of those arguments, so that if someone wants to use your code, it's pretty painless for them to use that and not have to guess. And then again, if there are output files, like you might see below, I also just quickly point out which scripts those output files are from, just so that no one is confused. Next slide. And then finally here at the bottom of my README, some other things that I wanted to quickly point out is if you look at that first arrow, I'm pointing out a place here where the user will need to supply their own API key. So something to keep in mind if you are doing API calls or having any other kind of, we call it secrets, like a private API key that you don't want to share broadly, because that means that people will be able to access your account. You need to point out where the user will need to supply their own data or their own API keys. Because again, it is very, very important to never publish your private API key. And there are ways, for example, a .env file, where you can store your private API key in such a way that it will not get pushed to your GitHub repository. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. And then one last thing that I wanted to point out in this README is to point out which scripts generated which figures, again, to help with reproducibility. So now the next file that I'm going to talk about is the data dictionary. So again, this is following what Brianna just introduced earlier. So the data dictionary is different from the README in that the README is talking broadly about the contents of the files, and the data dictionary is talking specifically about each column in each of your data frames, so that, again, the user doesn't have to guess where the data came from. So in this data dictionary document, I start out with a list of all of the CSV files that I'm going to be detailing, and I'll just show one quick example of what that looks like. So this is an example of the data dictionary for this one particular data frame. And you'll notice here that I've listed all of the columns in this data frame. I have the name of the column. I have a short description of what is in that column, in addition to the data type that is expected for that column and an example. And again, this is super useful if someone is either trying to understand your data frame, or if they're trying to add their own data or replicate your analysis for some data that they're interested in. So for example, in this first column, the name of the column is term. I have a brief description of what is in that column. Term expects a string, so just text. And then the example is a misspelling of the word codeine. Okay, next slide. And so there are some other components that I wanted to point out that aren't in the specific project repository that I was walking through here. But these are other components that I've included in previous repositories of mine, or that some of my lab mates have used, that I think are very helpful. And I think if anyone has ever tried to use someone else's code or tried to use someone else's GitHub repository, you will probably understand why these are helpful. So one thing to keep in mind is if you have a lot of scripts and if they have dependencies, it is crucial to list all of the requirements for your scripts. So this is an example from another repository of mine where I'm showing the exact dependencies. In my case, for the Python environment, you can manage these using something like Conda or a Docker container, because again, if someone doesn't have this exact setup, they might not be able to use your code. Next slide. Another thing that I wanted to point out, and again, this is key for reproducibility, or if someone wants to make their own figures with their own data following your style, it is really helpful to include a quick section on how to replicate the figures from your manuscript, again, for transparency and reproducibility. So I just have an example of this here where I walk through every single figure and I talk about which script and which parameters were used to generate that figure. And then one last thing that I wanted to point out here for components to add is data download links. And the reason why I add this is GitHub has a limit on the size of data files that you can upload to it. So if you have a small data set, you'll be able to upload that to GitHub, but once you hit a certain size, you will not be able to upload that into your repository. So some alternatives that you can use that are common are Zenodo or GitHub large file storage. If you're putting your data there, obviously it's key to point the user to where they can access that data so that they can actually use your repository. And so here is an example from one of my lab mates where they talk about where the data sets are hosted, they list the data sets, and then they also include a script to automatically download those data sets. And so this is super, super helpful for someone to be able to replicate your study and look at your data. So I wanted to quickly close with some recommendations and lessons learned, best practices, etc. And so the first thing is that it is super helpful to create a GitHub repository early in your project and make commits to it often. And this is something that's easy to not do and to be a little lazy. I know I'm guilty of not doing this all the time, but if something happens to your local files, or if you accidentally delete a really important piece of data that you should not have deleted, creating a GitHub repository and making commits frequently can save you, and you can retrieve that file that way. So that is just a quick plug to do that. It's really, that's the best practice, is to use this as version control while you're developing your project. The second data point, I alluded to this before. If you are using an API, or if you have any other type of password or private key, you do not want to put that on a public GitHub. It's just very bad. People will be able to access your accounts. And so something that you can use is called a .env file, and those will not get pushed to GitHub. And there are many packages in Python and in other languages in order to manage pulling variables from that .env file so that you don't have to include these private keys in your code. A third point, which again, I think we all know is best practice, but it's sometimes we feel a little bit lazy and we don't want to do this, but it's really best to write documentation as you're generating the data and writing the code and not after, just because it's easier to write documentation about something that you're currently developing than it is to try to remember what you did a few months ago when you're writing up the paper or submitting the package, for example. Another quick feature of GitHub that I wanted to plug is to take advantage of branches. And so these are different, if you have different branches, they're like different versions of your code base. So this is really helpful for collaborating with other people, where each team member has their own branch. And then when they're ready to merge, you can merge all of your changes together and then resolve any conflicts there. It's also a great way to test out adding new functionality and quickly be able to go back if you decide that you don't like it. So that's just another powerful part of GitHub that I think is a little underutilized sometimes. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is that I actually found it surprisingly easy to contribute to the Heal data platform. All I had to do was submit the link to my public GitHub repository. So again, they didn't tell me to say this, but it's super, super easy to submit to the Heal data platform if you have a GitHub repository already put together. So just a quick plug for that. And I think that is all from me, and I will pass it back to Sarah.
Thank you, Christy. We really, really appreciate that. I will make this comment before we move on to our next example. GitHub is an excellent repository for code, for anything that talks about analysis. That is one repository that we use for that. There are 26 or 27 HEAL compliant repositories. And so depending on your type of data, there may be repositories that are a better fit or a best fit or are required by your funding source. And so today's webinar, we're showing two different examples of two different types of data. So the social media analysis data that was shown by the team from Stanford, the repository of GitHub is an excellent place for the work that they've done, and they have documented how they have done that process really well. The next example we're going to show is a bit different. It comes from a different repository called Spark. The Spark portal is an open access science initiative dedicated to advancing understanding of the autonomic and the peripheral nervous system and their role in health and disease. Spark provides researchers with collaborative, fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable platform to drive discovery and innovation. Inside the Spark portal, you will see HEAL-funded data that may include a brainstem, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, imaging, microphysiology, omics data, as well as code and software. For the example that we're showing today, what you will see is that every Spark data deposit has a DOI, and there is a recommended citation for data reuse that can be downloaded or copied. This is a genomic study, and so the study description includes keywords that are understood both by people who are in this research area or for those who may be searching keywords. As you will note, it's written in standard very plain English. So even if you have no idea about genomic sequencing, there are words you can recognize and you may be able to use if you are looking for data reuse or for meta-analysis. In addition, this particular data set submitted both primary and derivative data. So if you're looking for an example of how to do that, this is an excellent example. And as you can see in the description, they organized their folders by their data type, and they included descriptions that both describe the data generally and with the research protocols that were used. The next thing that we'll see is that the file names are very easy to understand. They are organized, they are clearly labeled, the README file and the metadata file is there. There's information on both the samples and the subjects, and the primary data has its own folder and the derivative data has its own folder. You can also see the sizes of the folders in case there are implications for downloading data, and if there's any versioning, those are also included here. One thing that Spark requires is that the funding source to the data set is identified and linked to its NIH reporter or its funding source record. As a rule, it is good to include the funding information in your data submission, even if it is not required. It can be included in the study description metadata or anywhere that free text is allowed in the repository submission. You will also notice that Spark requires study protocols to be submitted to Protocols.io with the link to the protocol included in the Spark data submission. Protocols.io is a HEAL-compliant repository and an excellent option for storing study protocols, particularly when that documentation is not required or cannot be submitted in the primary data repository. One other thing that this submission does well is it links the related publication. It links a citation, it has information that will get you directly to the publication, and it makes it very, very easy to link the data to the actual publication. So if you're looking at both at the same time, it's possible, as well as if you look at the publication links to this repository. We understand that there is a lot of different types of data in the HEAL data ecosystem, and that there are resources that have been developed for work and to help with data management. NIH specific resources that we will provide at the end of this email, in an email at the end of this webinar, include things about data management and its sharing policy and its overview. There's an NIH data management resource. the NIH Pragmatic Trials Collaboratory Living Notebook is excellent for anyone who is working with clinical trials. There's an entire section on data collection, data dissemination, publications, and data reuse. Our healdatafair.org website has resources on metadata and CDEs, or what we call common data elements. We have both a tool to help you identify which HEAL compliant repository may be the best for your data, as well as a list of all the characteristics and general guidance for submitting to data to those repositories. There's additional assistance around sensitive data and resources that can be helped to use with de-identification and or identifying different types of sensitive data within the HEAL data ecosystem, and as well as there's guidance on data curation costs and submitting data for data submission. As Dr. Larrick highlighted today, there is also the platform data sharing guidance tool, and we will include that link in the follow-up email. In addition to our NIH and HEAL specific resources, there are a lot of other resources that will help with data deposition and data submission. The CURE Consortium has an excellent piece of literature around curating research artifacts to support scientific inquiry and integrity. ICPSR, which is one of our HEAL compliant resources, guide to social science data preparation and archiving. That is in its 6th edition, and it is a highly detailed guide if you're looking at data around social science research. The curated workshop curriculum out of the Data Curation Network will walk you through how to curate data for a data submission. Harvard does an excellent resource on components of the README file. Both Harvard and NIST have excellent checklists on general research data management. So from the beginning of the life cycle, where we got on at the very beginning of our little Ferris wheel, all the way to the end, there's some excellent checklists that will help you go through it. GREI just put out one for generalist repositories as well. And in addition, at your own institution or organization, you may have resources within a data librarian or with your data management core that can help you with resources that you would need to submit data for your research project. So at this time, I'm going to turn the conversation back to Aubrey.
Wonderful. Just fixing my camera. Thank you so very much, Sarah, and to the rest of our speakers for that presentation. If we could move to the next slide. Oh, never mind. Perfect. We're already there. So thank you to all of our presenters today. So to summarize, the key takeaways from today's webinar are properly packaged data enhances scientific discovery, collaboration, and reuse. Data accessibility supports findability and reusability for meta-analysis, integrative research, AI readiness across HEAL-funded studies, and well-documented data sets encourage cross-discipline insights and facilitate new therapeutic discoveries. Next slide, please. We will now move on to the Q&A session. So if everyone would please turn on their cameras, we will now stop screen sharing to begin the question and answer session. All right. Wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started. So for the first question, it is NIH changed and updated their data sharing requirements for grants submitted after January 25th, 2023. Can you comment on differences in data sharing requirements for projects that were submitted before versus after this deadline? And Sarah, if you want to take the first attempt at this.
Sure, I can. A lot of the changes were around when data sharing had to happen and how much data had to be shared. It is also really dependent on your FOA or your NOA as to the requirements that existed. But the requirements that we went over around sharing data at the time of publication or at the time of performance period were definitely defined more in the 2023 guidance. And so this applies to any funding that came out after November of 2022. So if you do have questions about what data sharing requirements apply, the best place to start is with your FOA and your announcement of funding, your award, and then if you have any further questions, you're welcome to reach out to us or to your NIH project officers. As well as it looks like we've also dropped in some links which give you some comparison charts if you're looking for very specifics.
Thank you, Sarah. The next question I think is geared towards the platform and what Brianna spoke to earlier. So this person said that you mentioned terms governing use of the data as part of the metadata, and they were wondering if you could just explain a little bit more about that, as they're not really clear what terms they're permitted or expected to have.
Yeah, thank you, Aubrey. So this is mostly referring to human subject studies, in which case you've ideally obtained specific permissions from or consent from research participants and IRB approval to share data that are de-identified and consistent in a manner that is used in the consent forms. So in this case, you are wanting to adhere to that, any applicable institutional requirements, and generally, the repository will have procedures for if the data need to be shared in a way that restricts or controls access, or if there's some procedure for gaining access to the data, there may be some repository specific information there. So that's what I meant by that.
Great, thank you for the clarification there. We do have another question, I think, towards Brianna, geared towards you. This person wants to know, does pre-processed data mean no cleaning at all?
It doesn't need to. Typically, this is sort of programmatic processing and applying procedures or pipelines that are used to align, multiple data sets for analysis. So it is not necessarily like the manual cleaning and filtering things. It's more just the programmatic preparing a data set for uh, aligning of data sets.
Great, thank you, Brianna. Our next question gears towards GitHub. So this person wants to know a little bit more about what is GitHub exactly, and if it's something that HEAL investigators are required to use. And then there's a follow-up question after we go through that first part.
So I can start. So GitHub is most often used for storing and archiving code and things used to process or analyze data. It's not a requirement that HEAL investigators use GitHub, but it is, if you do have code to share, a very appropriate place for that. And then I think the second part of the question can go to Christy unless Sarah has any additional information to share there.
Yeah, the one piece I would say is Christy's examples an excellent use of GitHub, and we'll make sure that the follow-up question, Christy, goes to you. But there are times with HEAL research, if you are doing modeling, if you are doing mathematical sort of computations, if you are looking at different like large language models for text analysis, there's places where GitHub is useful for that research. And anytime there is code or analysis code that applies either directly to the publication findings or to either the primary or the secondary research aims of the project, GitHub is a great place to put that code, particularly if the repository that you're using for the data set does not allow for that. So GitHub is code. We don't put data, generally large data, and we don't put HEAL data in GitHub, but it is an excellent place for code. And so Christy, I'm curious, could you explain how your study team utilizes GitHub?
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I just want to underscore the point that if you are generating a lot of primary data, and if that is the primary thing that you're sharing, then GitHub is not the right place for that. My work is on computational methods development. So that's why I use GitHub for basically all of my projects, because I'm sharing a lot of code. And the data, again, is either small enough to be put on GitHub or, can be put on Zenodo or some of these other file sources. So again, for GitHub, it's a lot of versioning code. and sharing tools. So a lot of my work specifically is on creating these computational methods, and then a really easy way for folks to be able to use those methods for their own work is by cloning a GitHub repository. So I see the use case where GitHub is not right for all projects, but if you are writing code, it's a really nice way to collaborate with your team and then also to make your code accessible for people to use later.
Thank you all for that answer. And we do have a follow-up question on GitHub. So this person wants to know, if you use GitHub for your data package repository, do you get a DOI for a data citation?
So I do know that GitHub through Zenodo does offer the capability of archiving a repository, like with Zenodo, and then creating a DOI for that. I'm not sure about the use case of just GitHub within itself. I think DOIs are most useful when they're meant to be used for an artifact that kind of exists and is final, and is not going to be fluid over time. So if you're going to continue to make changes to your code and to the contents of a GitHub repository, I think an archived version of that would be the appropriate thing to create a DOI for, as opposed to the living document.
And GitHub is a tool, so it's assigned to an individual person, and then other assumptions can be done to a lab. So if you are using GitHub for a research project, the department may want to have a general account, because if you leave and then your GitHub work is still assigned to whatever email address you registered with. So that is also something to think about. Both with GitHub and some other repositories, is to who you assign access to and what details they need to have access so that you can still see what is there.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Christy. So this person noticed that the example project you shared used the MIT license for their code. So they wanted to know if the GNU General Public License v3 is acceptable as well.
Yeah, so I can't really speak to the HEAL requirement side. So maybe Sarah Brianna can talk about that. But in general, with the team that I work with, we choose the license on a project by project basis. So based on how we want the code to be used. Again, in general, for us, we want people to be able to use the tools that we develop. So we want it to be pretty open. But yeah, if I had to guess, then I would think that that license is fine as well, if that works better for your use case. But I'll let Sarah or Brianna comment if there's any restrictions on the HEAL side.
I'm not aware of HEAL restrictions. It's definitely what fits with the research study, the requirements, and then the institution that is managing the project.
All right. Thank you for those answers. The next question is continuing on GitHub. So this person wants to know, when should they use a private GitHub repository versus a public one? And what should they keep in mind when making a repository public? And Christy, I don't know if you want to take a first attempt at this.
Yeah, for sure. So usually what we do is when the project is in the development phase, obviously keeping that private for your own version control or for collaboration between teammates. And then when we submit the manuscript, we'll make the GitHub public. And in my experience, usually reviewers will check to see if the GitHub, if you include the link to the GitHub in the manuscripts, they'll check to make sure that it's public to see if your data and code is actually accessible. And it's very common in computational work to include a link to the GitHub in the manuscript so that people know where to find the code. And then some things to keep in mind when making a repository public. One best practice is actually to not transition your private repository to public, but instead to make a whole new repository that's public, because the end users don't need to see your whole development process. And then that also gives you a little bit of a safety net just in case you included some private information that you might not want to make public in the process of developing your code. Just to summarize, one best practice might be to use the private GitHub for collaboration with your teammates and for your own version control, and then to make an entirely new public GitHub repository once you have everything all cleaned up and ready for submission.
Thank you for sharing those tips, Christy. This next question I'm going to give to Brianna to start. So do you have any guidance for using Cedar?
Yes, we do. So Cedar, for those who aren't familiar, is a third-party platform that we are leveraging to collect study-level metadata from HEAL investigators. And so what we're doing here is we've implemented a form that has some free text, but a lot of multiple choice, select all that apply, select from a drop-down list sort of questions that are about the nature of the study that you're conducting. So what kind of study is this? What kind of subjects or models are you using? What kind of data are you collecting? Just not data themselves, just information about the study that you're conducting that anyone who is very familiar with your proposal would be able to fill out. So by leveraging Cedar, we're collecting this study level metadata in a standardized way, which is great. And we do have some platform documentation on how to set up and get started with using Cedar. The first step is to register your study on the HEAL data platform. This is one of the requirements that is applicable to all HEAL investigators. Register your study. The process of registering your study creates a Cedar form. And I just put the link into the chat. Oh, it went to hosts and panelists. If someone else could pop that to all attendees. I'm not sure it went there. Thank you. Yeah, this will walk you through exactly how to create your Cedar form and fill it out. Once you do fill out your Cedar form, one thing that is very helpful is the information that you put here is synced with your study record on the platform. That's why we are asking HEAL investigators to do it. And you can download your complete study level metadata record by clicking the Download SLMD button that's on your study page. So it is helpful for search and filtering purposes on the platform. It is helpful to you as you're submitting your data to a repository if you just want to export those study level metadata and then go ahead and upload with your other files.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brianna, for all of that information.
So,
Go ahead, Sarah.
sorry. I was going to say, I've definitely seen some other questions in the chat around repositories. Open ICPSR is definitely a HEAL compliant repository. And if you have questions about repositories or data depositions, please contact the HEAL stewards. We're happy to help assist your teams with some specific questions. And so, yeah, if you have specific questions, we're more than happy to set up consults or answer any questions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm definitely seeing a lot of questions in the chat. So please reach out to us and I'll be sharing some information now, but we'll go ahead and close the Q&A session so we can close out today's webinar. So if we could jump back to the slides and share slide 45. All right, thank you. So in addition to our presenters and the panelists, we'd like to acknowledge the behind the scenes team listed here who worked diligently to bring this webinar to production. So thank you to everyone listed here. Next slide, please. And I want to thank the audience for your participation in today's webinar. I saw the Q&A really, really lighting up, so that was awesome to see. And so in addition to a recording of this webinar, we will also email everyone who has registered a list of resources so you can get those links that were displayed on screen. We'll also share the slide deck and a link to our Slack channel and the Connect With Us form so you can continue to engage with us. And we really hope that you'll reach out to the HEAL Stewards team for questions or support as you embark on your FAIR journey to maximize the value of HEAL data. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on Thursday, April 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which will focus on HEAL publication requirements and best practices. So thank you again, everyone, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. And thank you to our panelists.